Okay, I can't stand standing in front of a podium. So, I'm going to come down here. Here I totally support and have supported the mission of Heartbeat for moving from Boston University to join in. And one of the things that I brought during the board meetings, because they would complain, the banks need this model or this capability, that capability, whatever, and your companies are donating CRTD, dual-chambered biventricular defibrillators. They can't use that. The companies donate that, but there are no coronary sinus leads. So even though we got the Heartbeat gets the, they don't get the leads to go along with it. Or, for example, the coronary sinus lead, well, you can manipulate and fish it in and get into the coronary sinus. It's not as easy unless you have the appropriate introducers, and those don't come. So the question is, how do you get the maximum benefit out of these devices? Now, let's say the challenge: the bank has 20 candidates for pacing. Heartbeat International has received 10 CRT-D pulse generators, but no high voltage ventricular leads, no CS leads, and no CS introducers. What do we do with this? Okay. And none of the potential candidates for pacing need a CRT-D. Think about which patients you're putting pacing. Remember when shortly after St. Jude Medical acquired Siemens Pacesetter. So this was in October of 1994. Early in 1995, they sent me on a trip to India, which was my first time in India. It was an absolutely fascinating trip. I went to multiple different cities: Hyderabad, Madras, which is no longer Madras, and Calcutta, and Bombay, and Delhi, and they all now have basically new names. But that's besides the point. Or they have old names reapplied. And my mission was to give a presentation at each of these different cities in the evening, and during the day meet with various key physicians in the cities at the different major hospitals. But the theme of the talk was and the talks were very well received, and after the presentations, they had a big reception, and I'm getting to meet a lot of the physicians who attended, and it's very apparent to me that these physicians are extremely knowledgeable. And then on the other hand, they say they don't see pacemaker syndrome. And you sort of can't put those two together until it all of a sudden occurred to me that back in the 1960s in the United States, we didn't see pacemaker syndrome either. But it is extremely common. Because who gets the pacemaker? Certainly in India and other countries where the majority of the population is extremely poor. It's not that the physicians don't know anything about these devices. The patients have to pay for them. And the patients can't afford them. And certainly they might be able to afford a $4,000 pacemaker, but not a $10,000 pacemaker. And so, pacemaker, they were not putting pacemakers into an elderly individual who's a little bit tired and weak, mean heart rate is 50 beats a minute. Most of the patients who got a pacemaker had complete heart block and were basically absolutely pacemaker dependent. Their intrinsic rate was 20 beats a minute. And with a VVI pacemaker at 60 or 70, and VVIR, because no one has a non-rate modulated pacemaker today, they did so dramatically better that they did not recognize that they were limited. And that's the key point. The patient, we can make the patient better, even though they could have been theoretically even better with a dual chamber. They felt so they were still being limited. So what should we do in this situation where we have 10 CRT-D very sophisticated pacemakers, and here's just a picture of one, and we got multiple channels, and there are others on the back side as well. So, okay, 10 active fixation bipolar leads with IS-1 terminals, but they all have IS-1 terminals today, and that which makes it nice because we can mix and match in Boston, St. Jude Medical. Fit 2 passive fixation bipolar ventricular leads, and 2 passive fixation bipolar atrial J leads. And so this is what Who are your patients? Think about it. A rhetorical question. The vast majority will have complete heart. Sinus node dysfunction, but not sinus node dysfunction or intermittent. This has to be severe. This has to be when I see a patient follow up and temporarily reduce the rate to 30, their pace at 30 beats a minute. Neurocardiogenic syncope, which is pacemaker. And end-stage heart failure today, based on studies that these patients will benefit from a CRT-D system. But you can help a greater number of people focusing on the heart block patients who are really very symptomatic functional life. So we're going to take the initial pacemaker, or ICD, so here's the high voltage parameters, and there's the low voltage parameters. And what we're going to do is disable high voltage therapy. I don't need it. Okay? Actually, in the St. Jude devices, in the box, it's already disabled. It needs to be disabled by the physician at the time of implant. And I really don't know whether this is the case with Medtronic and Boston Scientific as well. But then we program it to VVI or VVIR. Or we could program it to, if the patient has severe six-sided syndrome, think about putting in just an atrial lead and program it to AAIR. This will do a world of good. Okay? Now, there are 2 points with respect to AAI. One is you need to perform what I call an AV nodal conduction. If I pace at a progressively higher rate, will this patient develop significant AV block? Okay? And that's done. So I want to get to AAI pacing rates greater than or equal to 140 beats per minute. And this will work very effectively, particularly if I have a patient operation, because I no longer do the actual procedure. And this way until we reach battery depletion and need to intervene anyway. So here's my AV nodal conduction stress test. I simply program them. This is atrial pacing, intact AV conduction. I go to AAI mode, because others will let me go up very high in DDD. Medtronic, I have to do the evaluation in the AAI mode. That's fine. But notice what happens. As soon as I'm pacing at a fast rate, we're starting to develop a Wenckebach AV block. So this would be a patient in whom I would not put in an atrial pacemaker. Now, if the only lead you have available is a passive fixation lead, then please use a temporary pacing wire to test them before you find out that, oops, I can't use a single chamber atrial pacemaker. And I gotta now put the lead in the ventricle. If you're using an active fixation lead, which you can disengage it and then move it down to the ventricle, it'll be fine. The other is do not use chamber atrial pacing in neurocardiogenic syncope. Long and who was very, I put in an AAI. This is about 1979. So it's all in, it's implanted, the pocket is closed, and I figured, well, let me just do some gentle carotid sinus massage to demonstrate that we're stabilizing the patient. And we did. We stabilized the atrium very nicely. But we unmasked AV block. And your neurocardiogenic syncope patients, whether it's the vasovagal or hypersensitive carotid sinus, when they slow down the sinus mechanism, they also create AV block, but you can't see that because they're activity at the moment. So please, if you say, I can't manage them with meds, they keep fainting and everything else, and I'm convinced it's neurocardiogenic syncope, unfortunately, those patients do best if they're going to do pacing at all with a dual chamber. But what you do, very, very sophisticated pacing. and down program it, for example, to VVI. Now you have one lead and the pacemaker. Now you say, well, gee, I don't know, those CR bigger. Yes, they are bigger today than the pacemakers. No question about it. But I see Dr. Alfaro sitting here, and Puerto Rico, I think you and I both know that back in the 70s, the pacemakers we used then are bigger than the biggest devices we have today. These big gigantic monsters are 15 to 20 millimeters thick, in addition to being round, in infants. And the surgeon will put the epicardial wires on, and you see this big tumor sticking up in the belly. If that's what they need because we don't have anything else, that's what we did. And the patients did great. So please, if you need to use this as a single chamber device, do it. Now, if the patient is very thin, consider placing it under the pectoralis major muscle. I think that's it. The bottom line is, heartbeat doesn't get as many devices as it really needs, as the banks are requesting. Many of the devices that it gets are far more sophisticated than the patient absolutely needs. Or if you hold out, well, look, I've got 10 CRTD devices now sitting on a shelf in my bank in Guatemala. I got to wait until I have 10 patients who really need the full capabilities of that device. You know, if I got a patient with complete heart block today, they get it, and I down program it to VVI or VVIR. Now, the only caution about all that, the companies, and most of them they'll donate that directly, are these little plugs that fit into the various ports that you're not going to be using. The other thing you can do is just leave them open. You have fluid and blood and everything else will get in there and will mess it up, so you can't possibly upgrade that system in the future to one with greater capability by adding new leads. But again, that's going to be a trade-off that you make. It's not going to hurt anything. Particularly if I'm programming the VVI, the fact my atrial channel is open and getting plugged up with gunk doesn't make any difference to the patient. Okay, any questions? Yeah. Well, you need a programmer for that manufacturer. So they'll need a St. Jude Medical. I will come back to St. Jude Medical in a moment. Boston Scientific, Medtronic, which are the three major contributors at this point. Okay? Because otherwise the Medtronic programmer simply will not interrogate or be able to program a Boston Scientific or a St. Jude device. Now, one of the things that I have cautioned in the past to heartbeat is when you go for a donation from St. Jude, one of two things. Either you want the legacy devices only, which can be programmed with a 3510 program, which I believe now is available in virtually every bank. Remember St. Jude a number of years ago making a major donation. But the newer devices, what's called on the Unity platform, which is their in-house name for a whole new platform for these devices, require the Merlin programmer. And that they're not giving out so easily. So if you're using the current generation devices that have a Merlin programmer, fine. Let Heartbeat know. But if you're not and you don't have access to it, giving you the first picture I showed, which was a St. Jude Medical Promote, that requires the Merlin programmer. And if you don't have the Merlin programmer, guess what? You've got a non-programmable device. So yeah, we did that. We had VOO and VVI years ago. And we did it. We worked very effectively with it. But just be aware that it becomes a non-programmable device for all of its sophistication. So one of the things I know that Heartbeat has sent out periodically to the banks is a request, please tell us what programmers you have available in your banks or even in your clinics, particularly if they're in the same place. So they can then know. For example, even if we gave you a legacy St. Jude device, but you were using Medtronic and you didn't have a St. Jude programmer, that still becomes a non-programmable device for you. Okay, another question. You can use medical silicone, what's called Med-A. It comes in small packages that are sterile. So 1 use, you squeeze it in, and whatever's left over, you don't really save. That can plug it up, but that does the same basic problem as just leaving it open. It totally destroys the pacemaker for an upgrade in the future. Okay. Now, that's fine. If that patient today needs a VVI pacemaker, they got complete heart block, they lost AV synchrony with VVI compared to DVD. But at the ventricular escape rate of 20, they didn't have AV synchrony then either, which is why they feel so much better simply increasing the rate. What it does prevent is that if someone inadvertently who doesn't know, say, wait a minute, this is a dual chamber pacemaker, let me program it to dual chamber, and now we start putting out current via the atrial port that obviously doesn't stimulate the patient, but certainly drains the battery. Okay, so that would prevent that. So even if you turn that on, it would be non-effective. Any other questions? Good question. Not necessarily. The problem is, at least again, with almost everybody's current generation and early generation ICDs. Well, let's back up a little. The low voltage device is using a lithium iodide battery. Was very efficient at low voltages. Very efficient. But it would take hours to potentially charge up to deliver a high voltage shock, which is obviously not practical if you really need the defibrillator. The battery that will charge up very rapidly to deliver high voltage therapy, like in 10 seconds, the lithium vanadium pentoxide cell is terrible when delivering low voltage outputs. It is very inefficient. And so if you're doing a lot of low voltage pacing, and that's what we're doing, the battery longevity, the device longevity is probably not going to be better because you're only doing low voltage pacing. Now, everybody is going to new generation batteries, and you can talk to the manufacturers about it, but we simply don't have the track record yet to know that these will really hold up. I remember in the early days of lithium, when I was in Boston, and this company came up and told me that their lithium battery, lithium iodine, was great and do all this good stuff. That turns out to be the workhorse. But someone else had lithium thionyl chloride, someone else had lithium cupric sulfide, someone else had lithium this and lithium that, and all the sales rep getting the story from the manufacturer. This is great. This solves all the other problems and everything else. But one of my first lithium cupric sulfide powered pacemakers went belly up through the battery depletion in 7 months. Obviously, they didn't hold up because one became the dominant lithium battery. So, very honestly, at this moment, we simply do not know. The manufacturers have done due diligence, they've done engineering testing, they believe that the battery will really hold up and will be better in the long run. We really don't know. Okay. It gives me great pleasure at this time to introduce now a colleague of mine at UCLA and Olive UCLA Medical Center, Dr. Robert Brigg. He joined the program at Olive U a number of years ago, which is when I met him for the first time. And he's done some very, very interesting analyses. You don't have his presentation in the handout. Actually, you didn't have this one either. I just literally did this one earlier this week. And we've been talking about some of these studies, and he's giving me a totally different perspective on them. I was already a little bit quizzical. I remember my very first multi-center study involving thousands of patients in each group, and they said with this cholesterol binding agent that you would swallow and would be terrible multiple times a day, it reduced the incidence of MIs by 25%. Out of 1,600 patients in each group, one group who wasn't taking the active drug had 20 MIs, and the other group that was taking the drug had 15 MIs, so that's a relative difference of 25%, but an absolute difference that is trivial. So I suggested this to the education committee, and I then invited Bob to come and join us and give us some of his perspectives on these new studies.